I'm Jeff Paulette. I am the director of the Ford Leadership Forum here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center. Jeff Nelson has been a good friend for a long time, and I've been honored to do a lot of work with him over the years.
Oh, Jeff can tug at the heartstrings. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this gathering on the prospects for Anglo-American conservatism in the tradition of Russell Kirk and Roger Scruton. I, of course, want to thank our partners here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, especially Jeff. As he said, he's been such a good friend and an ally and a wonderful senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for a long time, but also to his terrific team. Really benefited from working with his team to put all this together and make this as wonderful occasion as we hope it will be. And we're also grateful to the Foundation's executive director, Gleaves Whitney, who couldn't be here, for his hospitality as well, and for all the Ford groups allowing us to hold this conference in this notable setting, a place itself that conserves, as Jeff put it so beautifully, the legacy of one of America's most decent and constitutionally grounded presidents. I would like to acknowledge as well, before we begin, and ask to stand, our two other indispensable conference architects, Dr. Ferenc Horscher, head of the Research Institute of Politics and Government at Ludovica University of Public Service, and Andrea, as well from Public Service, coming all the way from Hungary, and Dr. Daniel Pitt. Where's Dan? There he is. We had very little sleep, didn't get into 4:30 this morning, but a lot of energy and enthusiasm for this conference, so Dan's great. Standing over here, I now know what Jeff means. I can't see it. I can see my beautiful wife, so I guess that's all I need to see. My eyes don't need to go farther than that. But I would like to introduce the team, not just introduce them, but also just so you know who they are, because we're going to be around 2 days. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of little nooks and crannies here. So don't hesitate to reach out and just grab one and talk if you see them. But as I mentioned, Cecilia Kirk Nelson is the Kirk Center's manager of publications and oversees our archive. The Kirk Archive is really quite an amazing treasure, and she's done a wonderful job, an important job of digitizing, organizing, and making it come very, very much more useful to scholars from around the country. So thank you, Cecilia. Emily got a shout out. I don't think I can beat Rockstar, but Emily is our director of events, and she is, of course, the key architect in terms of knowing where everything is, when it is. So if you have any questions about the event itself, ask Emily. Our Ashley Jordan is our newest employee, and she's our director of advancement, our associated adventure of advancement. So she's new. If you want to get it really exciting, you want to find ways to help, support this conference now and later, and the book that we hope to publish, videos we hope to create, the Netflix miniseries where I've already been asked to options. So anyway, talk to Ashley. Daryl Falkenberg. Daryl Falkenberg oversees our academic program and is a newly minted PhD and is helping me with a little project that I'm going to mention briefly in a minute. And Chris Marlink is around here if you have any audio-visual questions or anything going on with cameras or too bright lights or microphones that work or don't work. Chris is the person to talk to. We also are blessed with a wonderful, thank you, group of interns this summer. Every year we have an intern program that grows, and it's really special this year. I think is Jesse Rogers there from Ave Maria, a politics and communications major. He's working on our free speech project that we have, and a couple other things as well. Brian Knutson from Hillsdale, hardworking Brian, is working with Cecilia to catalog all the treasury of audio files that Kirk basically tapes of all through the years, reel-to-reel, cassettes, everything. There's just so many thousands, and eventually we'll digitize all those too, and we'll have them up on a YouTube channel or something. Not all of them, but many of them. And we also have from Madrid. Well, actually, she's from Barcelona, but she goes to school in San Pablo in Madrid. Maria Jove, who's just got here the other day, but she'll be working on a number of social media projects and a couple of academic things with Daryl. Maria, are you there? I can't see you. And finally, we have our graduate student and resident fellow, Russell Kirkland Galloway, if you can believe that. I mean, if you can combine Russell and Kirk, well, if you can combine any combination of Russell and Kirk and your application to be a Wilbur Fellow, man, that is a sled ride right in. I mean, you're in. But Russell Kirkland, I mean, come on, that's too much. Galloway softens it a little bit. But no, it's terrific. So anyway, it's a great group. Thanks, everybody. They're around. They're at your service. And I hope you get to know them and they get to know you. Moving on, as Jeff mentioned, we gather here in this beautiful city of Grand Rapids, just an hour from Russell Kirk's ancestral village of Macasta. In recent years, a number of civic, cultural, and philanthropic leaders in this city have renewed their commitment to making Grand Rapids a national center for serious American conservative thought and expression, a Midwest catalyst for cultural renewal and restored political order grounded in our constitutional heritage. This unique gathering, with its 24 scholars from Hungary and Israel, Great Britain, and from across the nation, is part of that growing vision. I don't know if Grand Rapids is the center of the world this weekend or if the center of the world just relocated to Grand Rapids, but this group of speakers is world-class, and I hope everyone enjoys hearing from them. Among other things, this event marks the first major conference of the Russell Kirk Center's School of Conservative Studies. Some of you may have heard a little bit about it. This is the first major conference in this new initiative, which is dedicated to the study of conservative thought and its interdisciplinary applications. It's an educational initiative that explores the fullness of the conservative tradition and its humanistic foundations with students, researchers, professionals, and teachers at every level. Through residential fellowships, like Russell's, immersive seminars, online courses, certificate opportunities, and scholarly resources, the School of Conservative Studies will expand the Kirk Center's program aimed at forming the next generation of leaders grounded in the permanent things. We launched this school in confidence that the tradition Kirk and Scruton embodied remains vital for our age. At the heart of that tradition is the Anglo-American conservative inheritance, a living synthesis of English constitutionalism and American republicanism, grounded in the belief that liberty depends on the rule of law, self-restraint, and ultimately moral order, that culture shapes manners, institutions, and character, and that our duties transcend our appetites. It is a tradition shaped by Richard Hooker's natural law theology, the common law jurisprudence of Edward Cook, John Selden, and William Blackstone, and the imaginative depth of Shakespeare, Milton, Johnson, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It includes the practical wisdom of Edmund Burke, the constitutional statecraft of the Federalist, and the moral gravity, literary, legal, and philosophical, of Nathaniel Hawthorne, Joseph Story, and Orestes Brownson. In the 20th century, it was renewed by T.S. Eliot, Irving Babbitt, Michael Oakeshott, Russell Kirk, and Roger Scruton. This is not a tradition of abstract doctrine, abstract dogma, or ideological blueprints, but one of cultivated reason and historical continuity. It is a living inheritance, legal, religious, literary, economic, and political, grounded in those permanent things and ordered to the flourishing of persons and communities. Even so, as Jeff mentioned, we know that today conservative and tradition are contested words, subjected to scrutiny and distortion from many sides. In some circles, conservatism has become little more than a politics of discontent and disruption. In others, it has been dismissed as obsolete, too genteel, too slow-moving, too nostalgic, or too loyal to institutions now seen as broken beyond repair. But we gather here to advance a deeper, older, and more enduring vision, a conservatism that begins in gratitude, one that honors the traditional moral order, the cultural inheritance of America and the West, and the duties we owe to generations dead, living, and not yet born. This is the conservatism of Burke and Adams, of Coleridge and Eliot, renewed in the last century by Kirk and Scruton, who, though separated by an ocean and different disciplinary commitments, were united in their belief that civilization must be loved if it is to be renewed, and that culture, not politics, is the source of renewal. Kirk reminded us that conservatism is not a bundle of policies or slogans, but a disposition, a way of seeing the world. Scruton no less taught that to conserve is not to stand still, but to cherish what is good and build upon it with love and loyalty. They were celebrated thinkers and writers, yes, but beyond that, they were stewards of our patrimony. They were our exemplars. And as we will hear tomorrow morning in 1988, they actually joined together in Mecosta at the Kirk Home and Library for a weekend student seminar. We are here to consider or reconsider the health of that inheritance, championed so ably by those two standard bearers, and hopefully find within it some resources for revitalization. Over the next 2 days, we will explore various dimensions of this tradition and also allow ourselves to ask whether a conservatism grounded in the Anglo-American inheritance still has a future, and what that future requires of us. At stake are not only ideas, but also opportunities. Opportunities for conservatives shaped by this tradition to offer principled responses to the challenges of our time, to resist the flattening forces of global technocracy with renewed localism and rooted community, to channel populist energies toward cultural recovery rather than cultural resentment, to roll back ideological intrusions into education and public life, to advance in economics of human scale and enterprise, to defend free speech as essential to order liberty, and to rebuild institutions that conserve rather than consume. These are not tasks for another time. They are before us now. Our first panel is focused on the philosophical foundations of conservatism and will be moderated by Dr. Michael Federici. Dr. Federici, also an old friend, is a professor of politics at Middle State University in Nashville and a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center. He is the author or editor of 6 books, including The Challenge of Populism, Eric Voegelin, The Restoration of Order, which I really, if you're interested in Eric Voegelin, get Michael Federici's book. The book itself is great, but the glossary of terms is about 60 pages, and it's absolutely indispensable to understand Voegelin. Whenever you read him, you'll have Mike's book next to you. So that's a big plug for Eric Voegelin, The Restoration of Order. He also wrote The Political Philosophy of Alexander Hamilton, Rethinking the Teaching of American History, The Culture of Immodesty in American Life and Politics, and the Catholic Writings of Orestes Brownson. His own presentation will explain the complementary theoretical characteristics of conservatism found in the works of Edmund Burke, Irving Babbitt, and Russell Kirk. And with that, we will open this conference and its consideration of the prospects for an Anglo-American conservatism in the 21st century. Thank you. Enjoy the conference.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is the microphone working? Yeah? Can you hear me okay? I have 2 tasks this afternoon. One is to introduce our speakers, and the other is to give a presentation. So first, a few ground rules. We are limited to roughly 15 minutes in our presentations. And we're going to go in the order in which the panelists are listed on the program. And I will introduce each panelist before his presentation. And James Matthew Wilson, is the first listed on the program, and so I will start with his introduction. He is the Cullen Foundation Chair in English and Literature and the founding director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. He is the author of 14 books. His most recent collection of poems is St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. He also has published a number of other works of poetry that have won numerous prizes. In the interest of time, I will not list all of those. In addition to his role at the University of St. Thomas, he serves as poet in residence of the Benedict XIV Institute, scholar in residence of Aquinas College, editor of Colosseum Books, and poetry editor of Modern Age magazine. He was educated at the University of Michigan, the University of Massachusetts, and the University of Notre Dame, where he subsequently held a Soren Research Fellowship. Wilson joined the University of St. Thomas, Houston in 2021, where he co-founded the Master of Fine Arts program. And he will present to us this afternoon on the conservative defense of Christian Platonism. James.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everybody for being here. I saw you all earlier before you came up on stage. I can no longer see any of you. These lights are no joke. A number of years ago, in my offices at Villanova University as the faculty advisor to the Russell Kirk Society, I was privileged to invite Roger Scruton to come speak. And in fact, I believe that was his last visit to the United States before his death. And in the months leading up to his visit, on the one hand, I appreciated the hefty sum that his speaker fee was going to require, and I'm grateful to ISI still for having fronted much of it. And thinking about those dollars, I think even his assistant felt a little bit guilty, and so she kept sending me emails saying, Dr. Scruton is already fast at work on his lecture for you. And I'd say, thank you very much. So then we welcomed Roger to Wayne, Pennsylvania, where he was staying at the Wayne Hotel, and we had him over to Villanova for a lunch where he discussed his first book on conservatism. And I brought him back to the hotel, and as we were walking up the steps of the Wayne Hotel, he said, so, what would you like me to speak about tonight? It's a good living if you can get it. I said, maybe talk about the pre-political we, which he did do. So he arrived on campus that evening with a single sheet of a yellow torn from a yellow legal pad, inscribed with a few hasty notes from a fountain pen. And he delivered a marvelous lecture, the substance of which I have no memory of, because I was sitting there seeing how many complete sentences in succession he could utter without looking at a note or batting an eye, and it was actually a solid hour of that. I can't compete with that, but I do have a few hastily scrawled notes to share with you. I genuinely want to present what I provided in my abstract some months ago to Emily, which I'll just read just in case anybody's in danger of getting lost. Edmund Burke's defense of the civilization overturned with the French Revolution attempted to preserve the Christian Platonic tradition that had guided Christendom, but which had also fallen into intellectual decadence. He was the first of many conservatives to fight for something good with shabby equipment, among them Russell Kirk and Roger Scruton. I want to begin with this term, shabby equipment. It comes to us from T.S. Eliot's East Coker. In the fifth part of that poem, we get really a good description of what it's like to be a writer and a thinker in any age, but I think it's especially apt for the conservative, the way he frames things here. Here are the lines. So here I am in the middle way, having had 20 20 years largely wasted, the years of l'entre-deux-guerres, trying to use words, and every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure. Because one has only learnt to get the better of words for the thing one no longer has to say, or the way in which one is no longer disposed to say it. And so each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate, with shabby equipment always deteriorating in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, undisciplined squads of emotion. Conservative thought will always be marked by a sense of belatedness, its owl of Minerva flight towards the articulate, coming just a moment too late. Its sense of failure to make articulate what can never be wholly expressed except in a form that is in some sense inadequate. If it's always a new beginning, it's a tardy one, and one made with shabby equipment, always deteriorating. Eliot came to understand this, I think, especially in light of the conservative's dilemma. And he expresses this in a lecture he gave in the early 1950s to the London Conservative Union, where he mentions in passing that conservatism, as he and we understand it, is a fusion of Tory and Whig elements due largely to the effect of the French Revolution upon the mind of Burke. Burke's thought is, in a very literal sense, reactionary. He would not have articulated the view of man and state that he did in the Reflections had he not been impelled to do so in reaction to the tumult in France. It is a criticism, but a pious one, to acknowledge that he must make his argument with shabby equipment, whatever comes to hand, even as he defends an order that is not merely a historical one, but an expression of the eternal. Burke defends something ancient, venerable, and indeed permanent, but does so with what he has to hand, which is not always what we might have preferred him to have. I want to reflect on 3 instances of conservatives battling things out with the shabby equipment that comes to hand, and to highlight the way in which we are both enriched by what they do say, even as we can envision a more richly satisfying account of the strong defenses that these respective figures made. So we'll begin with a look at Burke's defense, by way of Horace, of the classical and Christian Platonist understanding of reality, an understanding that I take to be the one authentic intellectual tradition of the West, even as it is universal in significance and no merely historical expression of things. Burke was a politician, not a philosopher, though he had more than modest claims to that title. We can take the measure of his defense and also contemplate what it might have been and take account of the gap between them. I'll pause here just for a second. There are different ways of using the term Christian Platonism. The most frequent use of such a term would be to contrast it with, say, an Aristotelian Christianity, the Christianity of Thomas Aquinas, etc. But when I use that term here, and when I use it in my book, The Vision of the Soul, which I'll be talking briefly about in a few minutes, what I really mean is the broader intellectual tradition that begins with Athens and Jerusalem. And just that, nothing more specific. I want to then continue to look at Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, which is a historical appreciation and a historian's appreciation of a tradition of thought. As a historian's account of that tradition, Kirk gives us the 6 canons of conservatism, which are what I would call a minimal doctrine, suitable for expression in an age of triumphant liberal democracy, that age in which he was writing. But in my view, Kirk, as a defender of the West and a Christian Platonic civilization, we can take the measure of that defense, its both adequacies and inadequacies. And finally, we'll conclude with just a brief look at the very vast philosophical work of Roger Scruton, who follows Burke and Kirk in having given a marvelous defense of the permanent things in an age of demolition and cultural rape. Here he can also measure the difference. We can also measure the difference between the actual defense and what might have been offered. There's a difference here, of course. Burke was a politician with some philosophical bona fides. Kirk was a historian, a philosophical historian, but a historian nonetheless. Scruton, however, was a philosopher who made a deliberate and indeed, in his age, an unusual choice. A choice to follow in the wake of Immanuel Kant, a practice that in some ways had been abandoned a century earlier with the death of F.H. Bradley, the last of the great English idealist philosophers. I don't want to try to exhaust any of these points. I just want to suggest them. So I'll try to do so as briefly as I can. For those of you who know the reflections on the Revolution in France, you'll know that as vast and great as that book is, there's a certain middle stretch that begins right around the line. How does it begin? It is now 16 or 17 years since when Burke begins describing his vision of Marie Antoinette, describing her beauty and condemning the age that has succeeded to the age of chivalry. In that great speech, or that moment, in the Reflections, Burke's continuous attention is to the aesthetic. He describes Marie Antoinette in terms of beauty. He describes the civilization and the order that she represents in terms of beauty. And yet he does so in a way that is distinctly Burkean, or at least, maybe more broadly, I should say, distinctly modern. It's deeply indebted to the thought of the Scottish Enlightenment, and behind them, those figures, Descartes, Hobbes, and then, just to mention names more timely, Locke and Hume. And this background to his remarks casts a certain shadow over them. I'll just mention how that shadow functions. First of all, Burke, in that passage in the Reflections, is beautifully, brilliantly, and troublingly allusive to Shakespeare's King Lear. And behind that illusion is the possibility that the order of beauty he's describing is, in Burke's own words, merely a pleasing illusion. That nature might be merely matter and motion, defined by force, as Thomas Hobbes had argued. And that political order is merely an artifice imposed upon nature to make life bearable. There's one shadow. Second is also this. Burke locates, at one point, the faculty of moral judgment in what he calls the realm of philosophic analogy. That is to say, he does think that the intellect plays a role in our understanding of politics, of culture, and moral life. But, showing his debt to the Scottish Enlightenment, he typically grounds his judgments on sentiments, on the feelings of human nature. And that creates a wrinkle on the page when, in the midst of his discussion of Marie Antoinette and her beauty, and the beauty of the order, he quotes Horace's Ars Poetica, one of the great epistolary poems of the Roman world, where, after quoting Horace, Burke writes, "There ought to be a system of manners in every nation which a well-formed mind could be disposed to relish. To make us love our country ought to be lovely." It's a beautiful line, but depending on the force of that line depends on what you mean by it. For Horace, in the Ars Poetica, he is a clear and untroubled heir of the classical tradition. He's part of the classical tradition. And when he speaks of the poetic work as lovely, and as analogous to the lovely or beautiful order of the world, he's making a serious philosophical claim that comes out of Aristotle and Plato. That the microcosm of things that human beings make is modeled on the intelligible macrocosmic order of an orderly and divinely governed universe or cosmos. When behind Burke's citation of Horace, however, is not this classical Platonic doctrine, or not quite. Maybe it'd be best to put it this way. It's there, and Burke is alluding to it and endorsing it, but his understanding of it is vitiated by the sentimentalism of the Scottish Enlightenment, rather than an intellectual perception of the orderliness of the cosmos informing the orderliness of the microcosmic acts of human making, whether it's the making of the poet or the making of the statescraft. Burke is appealing to sentiments, not to intellect. This sentimentalism, I think, partly weakens his otherwise noble defense of the Christian Platonic tradition that is the tradition of the West. I think of the late Alistair MacIntyre, who in his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, points out that all of the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment thought they were good Aristotelians. They thought they were good classical thinkers. But what they meant by that is they shared Aristotle's list of the virtues, as he gives them in the Nicomachean Ethics, but they had in fact, unknowing to themselves, replaced Aristotle's clear sense of the intelligibility of the world and the orderliness of things, known by the mind, with mere emotionalism or sentimentalism. They did it without even noticing. And I think Burke does something of the same. When Kirk reprised the conservatism of Burke in The Conservative Mind, he did something similar. He attempted to defend a tradition, the tradition of the West, the Christian Platonist tradition, but he did it with a sort of minimum effort to understand the deep roots of it, because his chief agenda was to give us a tradition of moral thinking. Let's see how much time I have left. 1 minute, perfect. Just what I wanted. I've got 20 minutes left. No, just kidding. I actually I was telling Michael that I basically got as much information here as I could have put in a comment box on Front Porch Republic back when people still did that sort of thing. So I think I can get through this pretty quickly. What I want to propose is this. Many of you will know in the introduction to the Conservative Mind, the 6 canons, a lovely list, but kind of an impoverished list. It's a minimal doctrine intended for an age of mass democracy, and in the typical American way, it's a consensus-building list. Broad nostrums that anybody can bring their previous commitments, moral commitments and intellectual commitments to, and generally sort of nod at, as long as they don't ask too closely what they mean. It was a smart move for what Kirk was trying to do, trying to outline a broad genealogy of conservative thought, but it's one that also, I think, requires deepening and enrichment. And one of the things I was pleased to do in my book, The Vision of the Soul, which I'll just hold up in case anybody's looking for a new expensive book to buy, was to flesh out the 6 canons and to give them what I would call a properly Christian Platonic reading. That is to say, to restore them into their roots, into the great writings of Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. With Scruton, as I mentioned at the outset, things are just a little bit more complicated. Scruton's a philosopher who chose to embrace the thinking of Immanuel Kant, and I know there are places where he refers to it almost as a revelation, and I can understand why he did that, why he was so charmed by Kant. In a predominant mechanistic age, an age of Newtonian physics, Kant cleared a space for human dignity and for the freedom of the person, and enabled us to give an account of that freedom that didn't seem to be overweeningly governed by the cold mechanistic operations of Newtonian physics. In the 20th century, we saw first the rise of an even cruder form of materialism than well, that's not possible, but almost as crude as Hobbes and Locke in the writings of people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. And Scruton found that a sort of idealist response to these materialists would make it possible for us to still take human freedom and human responsibility seriously. And so, for instance, in his great book, The Soul of the World, he gives us an account of the Lebensraum, the living room, the life world, that emerges out of a merely mechanical nature, but has to be taken seriously in its own right. And Scruton advocates what he calls a cognitive dualism, that when we're doing science, we can think about human beings as mere organisms, but that when we're actually looking at the fullness of our lives, we have to take seriously the phenomenological outgrowth of human expressions. And he does it in wonderful ways, including even going down to the minutia of describing what it means to be a human being when you smile and when you blush. The weakness of this approach is that it leaves intact the basic materialist account of reality. It refuses, as it were, to be properly metaphysical. And this more or less leaves in place a mechanistic account of the world while giving us a sort of option to take human life seriously as we may so desire. But one of the sources that Scruton cites in his book, The Soul of the World, and elsewhere, is Thomas Nagel's great book, Mind and Cosmos, which says something very different from we can read the universe in mechanistic terms, but also take seriously the human dimension of things. Nagel tells us that it would seem to be the case that mind goes all the way down in reality, and that our account of reality as such can't be cognitively divided. It has to be one. And so what we need to do to adequately address ourselves to the real and not stay in a position that really can be likened to late 19th century liberal Protestantism or Catholic modernism is to recognize that those intellectual dimensions and spiritual dimensions of life that Scruton describes so well at the phenomenological level actually need to be retraced back down into the very guts of reality. Mind is a principle of reality as such. And this is something that I think Scruton was unwilling to do for reasons that I think we could explore in the questions and answers. So, thank you.
Our second speaker is Micah Watson, a native of the great Golden State of California, as well as the Paul Henry Chair in Christianity and Politics at Calvin University, where he teaches in the Politics and Economics Department. He is co-author of Hopeful Realism and C.S. Lewis and Natural Law and Politics. He and his wife Julie and their 5 grown children, 1 son-in-law, and 3 pet-like creatures make their home right here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Micah will present to us on universal reason in particular.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I feel a little bit like Admiral James Stockdale in the 1992 vice presidential debate. Some of you may be old enough to remember that, as he opened his remarks with 2 questions. Who am I, and why am I here? When people ask me how long I've lived in Michigan, I respond that I wasn't born here, but I got here as quickly as I could. Similarly, though I've always considered myself a conservative, in comparison to the august present company and members of other panels, I was not born or raised with Russell Kirk nor Roger Scruton, but I've been trying to catch up as fast as I can, and I still have a long way to go. In my remarks today, I want to tease out what seems to me an ongoing tension between various strands or emphases or streams of the conservative mind and temperament. And that's the seeming tension, however real or imagined, between the role of reason in thinking about and actually living a conservative and flourishing human life, and the roles of custom, convention, place, experience, history, and all that is passed down from our fathers and mothers, as we see in the etymological root of tradition, pass on. So there are some things that conservatives clearly oppose: immanentizing the eschaton, utopian schemes meant to bring heaven on earth, whether a religious or a secular heaven. Conservatives also oppose a priori designs for perfecting human nature, as used by coffee house fanatics and metaphysical enthusiasts, to borrow language from Kirk, or to borrow from Scruton's language, reasoning from a set of axioms, as well as Scruton's robust suspicion of abstract ideas. The tension exists insofar as conservatives, including Kirk and Scruton, also clearly have a significant place for reason. One of Kirk's 6 canons, just mentioned, of conservative thought is belief in a transcendent order, which he refers to as natural law, something that helps us understand and apply justice. And when Kirk writes justice, it's with a capital J in his opening to the idea of conservatism. Kirk speaks of philosophical tenets and general principles to be distinguished from fanatic ideological dogma. Those principles are arrived at, he says, by convention and compromise, and tested by experience, which seems to me to speak more of how we come by them than what their ultimate source or ground is. Scruton, the accomplished philosopher, also has an important place for reason, rightly understood, describing the meaning of conservatism as aiming to find the concepts with which conservatives can provide themselves with a creed, adding to a later edition of that book an appendix in which he tries to show that there really is a philosophical basis for the doctrine I offer. Scruton also treats reason as being compatible, indeed necessitated, by our particular lives marked by tradition, place, and inheritance. He says near his opening of Conservatism, An Invitation to the Great Tradition, that the principal contribution that conservatism has made to human self-understanding, which is a rather grand claim that he qualifies with a probably, is that while Aristotle is right that one aim of political life is to refine the use of reason and to implant in the citizen the virtues that are necessary for its collective exercise, we rational beings need customs and institutions that are founded in something other than reason if we are to use our reason to good effect, end quote. All that seems to me to be correct, but I admit to sometimes wondering about how we distinguish between what's abstract and what's concrete, what's metaphysical and what's politically prudential. While history and tradition and experience and the charming and not so charming idiosyncratic particulars and foibles of hearth, hamlet, home, and village provide us with the material by which we learn about ourselves, our world, and what good living is, by what capacity or tool or aspect of our nature do we tease out what is worth conserving and what is not? When we inherit and experience competing and incommensurable customs, conventions, and context, can we then rely on a second-order custom to adjudicate between them? Customs, conventions, and experience are perhaps a bit like piano keys. They themselves cannot determine how they should be played. We contemporary conservatives have the great benefit of inheriting the wisdom of thought of both Kirk and Scruton and others. But Scruton describes Hegel, for example, as a true conservative whose political philosophy evolved into the most systematic presentation that we have of the conservative vision of political order. Kirk, on the other hand, writes of Hegel and Burke that, quote, people who think that these two men represent different facets of the same system are in danger of confusing authoritarianism with conservatism, end quote. Not to be too cheeky, but the principle that we should reject abstract a priori metaphysical reasonings seems to me to be, well, a little abstract. Is that bit of wisdom applicable to all times and places? Is it salutary counsel that we can confidently apply across the board? I'm not sure how a conservative is to answer that. Let's consider the following claims. 1, human beings have inherent and equal dignity, having been created in the imago Dei. 2, there is a supreme being who is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent. 3, the human soul is immortal and destined for eternity. And 4, speaking of Kant, human beings should never be treated only as means, but also as ends in themselves. These all strike me as rather abstract claims about reality, and there is plenty of experience, history, and custom to throw doubt on their reliability as truth claims. Does our everyday experience indeed tell us that human beings are actually equal? Are we all dignified? George Orwell in 1984 severely, in my mind, undermines this view in the torture scene in 1984 with Winston and O'Brien. And the qualities of God taught by classical theism strike me as metaphysical abstractions par excellence, as does the notion of the immortality of the soul. And yet, many of us, perhaps many in this room, learned these ideas and doctrines from our father's knee and in our mother's milk, seconded by Sunday school lessons and children's stories and folk tales and ancient scriptures passed on to us from generations stretching back for more than 2,000 years. And if that describes you, as it does me, then we have inherited customs, conventions, and practices that themselves point beyond the merely customary, conventional, and practical. They point to truths that are universal in scope and even abstract, though they are passed on to us through who we are as embodied and in-place human beings in families and churches and the local. I'm reminded here of Leo Strauss's autobiographical meditation from his later preface to Spinoza's Critique of Religion, which he wrote 34 years after that book was published. Strauss describes his earlier self as a young Jew born and raised in Germany who finds himself in the grip of the theological political predicament. He writes about the peculiar place of German Jews who were given full citizenship for the first time by the weak and vulnerable Weimar regime. The paradox for German Jews was that they had opened themselves up to German ideas and German culture, and yet this culture's political and spiritual core was fused together in a virulent Christian anti-Semitism. Weimar Jews believed that their predicament had been solved by liberalism, They were German citizens who happened to be Jewish, entitled to the same rights and standing as any other Germans. When this belief was shattered by the rise of National Socialism, a significant number of Jews turned to political Zionism. Liberalism had failed them, both in the weakness of the Weimar Republic and those purportedly liberal countries which, by forcing the terms of Versailles, betrayed their own liberal principles and in so doing ensured the death of the Weimar Republic. Strauss points out that strictly political Zionism was too narrow. It missed the history, blood, and tradition of Jewish culture and thus needed to be incorporated into a more substantial cultural Zionism, if it were to be more than a short-term political answer to the horrifying failure of European liberalism. Yet the cult in cultural Zionism survived among some Jews even after the fall of Nazism. And Strauss wrote that even as a middle position, cultural Zionism cannot help but become theological. He writes this: "One could not have taken this step unless one had previously interpreted the Jewish heritage itself as a culture, i.e. as a product of the national mind, of the national genius. Yet the foundation, the authoritative layer of the Jewish heritage presents itself not as a product of the human mind, but as a divine gift, as divine revelation. Did not one completely distort the meaning of the heritage to which one claimed to be loyal by interpreting it as a culture like any other high culture?" The answer, it seems, is yes. One does distort the meaning of the heritage, at least in this instance, as Strauss continues. When cultural Zionism understands itself, it turns into religious Zionism. But when religious Zionism understands itself, it is in the first place Jewish faith, and only secondarily Zionism. Now, there's a very interesting rabbit hole I will mention here but not go down, insofar as we could discuss Strauss's characterization of faith as obedience, which connects to some of Scruton's ideas, and in contradistinction to the place of reason, the life of philosophy, as Strauss sees these two in utter tension, even as he says that tension is the source of the dynamism of the Western tradition. But instead of that rabbit hole, I'll close my meandering meditations with two thoughts that follow from the suggestion that the bright lines drawn between abstract and metaphysical principles on the one hand and customary and conventional prudential political principles on the other may be blurrier than they are made out to be. For we have in the conservative position, particularly from Kirk, an emphasis on both the place of a transcendent order as a natural law and the role of prudence. If we go back to my fourth abstraction, that human beings should never be used merely as means but also treated as ends, and we combined that with another moral principle, that human sexuality should not be treated like a commodity, like rice or skateboards or matcha coffees on the market, we arrive at the conclusion that prostitution is unjust. As I understand the conservative antipathy toward utopian schemes and abstraction, what would be objectionable here would be a universal scheme to enforce this principle in a one-size-fits-all straitjacket that ignores local realities, norms, and history, as well as competing and jostling principles about the size and scope of government. That is why I'm encouraged that Augustine and Aquinas, two champions of theological abstractions as well as the central role of reason, condemned prostitution morally, but objected to outlawing it legally because they judged that, given the lecherous state of the people in that time and place, such a prohibition would only increase lust and bad behavior. This sort of judgment suggests that the real problem isn't with abstract principles per se, that is, with the directional judgments that reason and revelation may lead us to, but with a radical disregard for the finite and fallen nature of human beings, which is yet another doctrine, such that coffeehouse fanatics think that we can make the world anew with a mere Thanos-like snap of our fingers. So the importance of prudence is my first point, which is not at all original, but as Scruton writes, not being original is the first requirement of conservative thought. The second thing I conclude with as only a hint of a question to wrestle with, and that's how Scruton and other conservatives' emphasis on obedience works when what we've inherited itself points to an authority far more universal, powerful, and demanding than anything as transitory as the nation state, as important as that might be temporally, as Scruton implies in many of his writings. For if the Christian teaching about the immortality of the soul that I and others have inherited through a lived tradition is true, then our true home and identity is found in the city of God, which Kirk mentions frequently. And our most fundamental ties are to our brothers and sisters in the faith, even if, as Jesus scandalously taught, those spiritual ties might outweigh our bonds to our natural family. If we are immortal, then to quote an Irish conservative, You have never met a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals with whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Whether that is a conservative claim, abstract or concrete, true or false, I'll leave now as an open question. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Paul Mueller, a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. He received his PhD in economics from George Mason University and previously taught at the King's College in New York City. Dr. Mueller is also a research fellow and associate director of the Religious Liberty in the States Project at the Center for Culture, Religion, and Democracy. He owns and operates a bed and breakfast, The Abbey, in Leadville, Colorado, where he lives with his wife and 5 children. Among his publications is 10 Years Later, Why the Conventional Wisdom About the 2008 Financial Crisis is Still Wrong. And he will present to us this afternoon on the conservative bent for free enterprise in Scottish Enlightenment thought.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I may be the only economist you hear from this weekend, and so you can judge the remarks accordingly. I've known Jeff a long time, and he asked if I would come and speak and bring some of the economic perspective on conservatism that was there for a long time and now in some circles seems to have been lost to some extent. My dissertation was on Adam Smith and his moral and political thought in the Scottish Enlightenment, so I had to kind of dig out some of my older work here. Now I do a lot of public policy commentary, but it was fun to put together. So I'm going to be making an argument this afternoon about the importance of free enterprise to conservatism and how we see that in the Scottish Enlightenment. So again, the claim that I want to make is that free enterprise has been a core doctrine of conservatism since at least the 18th century. Though it's been somewhat obscured in recent years with the rise of protectionist and industrial policy focus of the New Right and Trump's MAGA movement, true conservatives, I would argue, as opposed to mere reactionaries and nationalists, have always prized the ideal of free enterprise that was pioneered and championed by Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. Private property, freedom of exchange, reasonable taxation, open competition, and a strong rule of law all make free enterprise possible. They also encourage self-governance and political restraint, both key values of conservatism. The Scottish Enlightenment, I think, should be seen as a proto-conservative movement. Certainly when we contrast it with the French or the German Enlightenments, the Scots look conservative. But their leading lights, Adam Smith and David Hume, have been hallmarks in conservative writing and thinking. And when one throws in Edmund Burke as an honorary member of the Scottish Enlightenment, after all, Ireland and Scotland had a close love-hate relationship at that time, the conservative bent, I think, becomes undeniable. So this paper is making the case that the 18th century thinkers in the British Isles laid much of the foundation for modern American conservatism. And that foundation included not only natural rights, tradition, reform, and rule of law, but a robust and deep defense of free markets, free enterprise, and free trade. Now, Russell Kirk's book, The Roots of the American Order, makes a compelling case that the American Revolution was actually largely about preserving Americans' rights as Englishmen. Although a new political order emerged after violent conflict, the American founding had a conservative bent to it. They also focused on natural rights, tradition, constrained government and classical political ideas, not to mention having strong religious ties and affiliations, which made the American Revolution markedly different from the French Revolution. Now, one might object to placing too much weight on the influence of, say, Adam Smith or David Hume on the development of the United States, as they were contemporaries of the Founding Fathers. But I would like to point out a number of reasons we should discount that objection. First, many of the Founding Fathers read Adam Smith. Both Jefferson and Hamilton owned The Wealth of Nations, as did many others. Second, Hume and Smith were not the sum and substance of the Scottish Enlightenment. They were perhaps the pinnacle, but they emerged out of an intellectual milieu of other important thinkers like Francis Hutcheson, Maclaurin, Carmichael, Shaftesbury, Locke, Thomas Boston, and others. And then third, we can also see direct Scottish influence on the American founding through John Witherspoon, who emigrated from Scotland and taught James Madison and other important American figures at Princeton. And then finally, the influence of Smith, Hume, and the political economy they developed, their influence on the U.S. need not be limited to just the Founding Fathers. It continued and expanded throughout U.S. history. But the purpose of this talk is to highlight some of the characteristics of free enterprise that Smith and Hume in particular articulated that I argue informed American conservatism and American government. Now, we've heard a little bit about this. Enlightenment thinkers have a complicated relationship with natural law. Some would argue there was widespread and relatively unmitigated hostility towards natural law, especially from a figure like David Hume, with his emphasis on the artificial and on convention. While this may largely be true, I think we ought to revisit the question of just how hostile Scottish thinkers in particular were to natural law, because it has great relevance for how they thought about property and social order. So I won't go into great detail here, but there's an important book by Stephen Buckle called Natural Law and the Theory of Property, Grotius to Hume. And in that book, he argues that Hume's philosophy of property and convention actually builds upon a particular strand of natural law, from Grotius to Locke to Pufendorf to Hutcheson to Hume. Conventions, Hume argued, though not natural in themselves, they emerge out of our nature. For example, why does the deed to a house or the title to a car give us ownership of those items? Deeds and titles are conventions. They're not something inherent in nature. You can't just go out and find them in the wild, right? And that means that there's no invisible, objective reason why these pieces of paper should grant us ownership of something. Yet it's clear, if you know much about natural law, that property flows out of our nature, and the natural rights as well. These things are built into the world around us. So though a deed is artificial, in one sense, this does not mean that it's unnatural. Now, conventions such as property or manners or the rule of law find their authority not directly in nature, but rather in tradition and custom. And this is where I think Hume and Smith take a fundamentally conservative turn. They generally advocated for reform rather than revolution, because they recognized how fragile society and polity can be. Plus, being from Scotland and England not that far away, those countries had a rough go of things in the century and a half before they were writing, with revolutions and religious conflict. So they were well aware of the potential fragileness of social order. They wrote that property and law, along with tradition, are bulwarks against faction and tyranny. More than that, though, property in a regime that protected trade, profit-making, and competition conduces to the common good. And so it's worth quoting Smith's famous passage here about the invisible hand to describe the ways in which property and the use of property in pursuing profit leads to public benefit. This is quoting Smith. He writes, "As every individual, therefore, endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and so to direct that industry that its produce may be the greatest value, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he's promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention." And so Smith and the Scots made a pragmatic case for the usefulness of property in markets, in addition to a principled defense of custom, convention, and rights. Their vision of an emergent or spontaneous order in markets via decentralized decision-making around personal interest radically altered the role of the statesman and the philosopher. No more did such people need to make plans or design extensive market or trade systems. Such plans could be left to those in the market themselves. In fact, Smith had great skepticism for government officials getting involved in the marketplace. He says, for example, that the statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but would assume an authority which could safely be trusted to no single person whatever, which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of the man with the folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. There are other famous warnings. I'm going to quote this passage just because it's beautiful and well known, and if you haven't heard it, you should. It is Smith describing why he's skeptical of government doing too many things, why government ought to be limited and constrained. And he describes what he calls the man of system, who believes that he can plan and direct society as he sees fit. So again, this is Smith. He writes, "The man of system, on the contrary, is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon the chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from what the legislature might choose to impose upon it. If these motions are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder." And so this man of system he criticizes for trying to run society like he would a chessboard. Now, coupled with his warnings about misguided political interference, Smith advocated regularly for what he calls natural liberty, to counter the aspirations of kings and politicians and even colluding businessmen. You've almost certainly heard about the difference between being pro-market and pro-business. Conservatives ought to be pro-market, meaning favorable towards private property, prices, and profit. That's where the invisible hand leads us to advance the common good as we pursue our ordinary business. That's where the legislature restrains himself and doesn't interfere. And Smith describes what happens when we have this world of restraint by political actors, where we have markets that are allowed to work, and property and private initiative and civil society. Again, Smith writes that when all systems of preference or restraint are completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest, his own way, and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men. The sovereign is completely discharged from a duty in attempting to perform which he must always be exposed to innumerable delusions. And so for Smith, we should favor minimal restrictions on competition and extremely limited government intervention. Smith was critical of government overreach, and he was critical of a pro-business mentality that allowed businesses to harness government to protect their interests. This leads to cronyism, or in another well-known passage, Smith describes how people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So this is not some overly utopian view of the world. He recognizes people are self-interested, but what he wants to make sure they don't have is the state to enforce their interests at the expense of everyone else. Now, Hume also argues similarly about limiting government about how markets work and leaving markets to work. He famously said that we should have a government system that was knave-proof, if you will, right? A government where if only knaves were to govern, they could do relatively little harm. If you think about that for a second, you're probably hearing echoes of the Federalist here and are not surprised that Madison, again, a student of Witherspoon, who's from the Scottish Enlightenment, that Madison wrote in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. And so in framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And so what I've hoped to have conveyed to you is that ultimately Smith and Hume and his contemporaries, including many of the American founders, were skeptical rather than optimistic about the function and the power and possibilities of the state. It's true they didn't have the modern libertarian non-aggression axiom in mind as what government should do, but they were concerned about tradition and property, liberty, and the tendency of governments to abuse their power. They were pro-market rather than pro-business. And so I'll leave you to reflect on our Q&A time to think about how these ideas reflect well or poorly on our current political regime and the new right more broadly. Thank you.
The final presentation of the panel is entitled The Burkean, Babbittian, and Kirkian Foundations of Conservatism. The history of American intellectual and political conservatism reveals its division into variants that converge and diverge. George Nash's The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America explains the origins and development of these central divisions. For most of the 20th century, types of intellectual and political conservatism were united by their opposition to highly centralized political power, whether in the form of communism and totalitarianism generally, or the progressive welfare state. Conservative opposition to totalitarianism and the progressive welfare state masked underlying divisions between competing types of conservatism. The Cold War era conservative consensus was strained by the collapse of the Soviet Empire. There are now at least 5 variants of conservatism: traditional conservatism, libertarian conservatism, neoconservatism, religious conservatism, and nationalist populist conservatism. My assignment is to explain and defend traditional conservatism, especially in its Burkean, Babbittian, and Kirkian philosophical roots. In doing so, I will focus on the interconnectedness between tradition, historical experience, and community, while explaining how they contribute to the realization and understanding of moral universality, the permanent element in history that inspires the highest potentialities of human existence. The philosophical roots of conservatism are historical, deeply embedded in Western civilization, and the product of the ongoing human struggle to know and realize the ends of politics and civilization broadly. The achievement of these ends is uncertain because humans are morally dualistic. They exist in tension between good and evil. Their free will determines the moral quality of their lives and character. The highest aspirations of civilization exist in tension with the lower inclinations of human will and appetite. What civilizational ground is gained can be lost. What truth is remembered can be forgotten. What is known can be ignored. Humans are imperfect and imperfectible. What good they can accomplish requires them to overcome their lower nature, to govern their desires in accordance with standards of virtue and civilization that are discovered in human experience. Conservatism's philosophical roots are better understood in contrast to liberalism's theoretical roots. While the two philosophical traditions share some theoretical ground, there are distinct differences between them. Traditional conservatives recognize and emphasize the fallen nature of human beings described in the book of Genesis, and the resulting division of the law of the Spirit and the law of members, explained by St. Paul in Romans 7 and 8. They recognize the continuity between this view of human nature in the Judeo-Christian tradition and the human proclivity to conceit and pride portrayed in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, literature, and history. Progressive liberalism follows Jean-Jacques Rousseau and accepts the natural goodness of human beings. The cause of evil, in his view, is not the nature of man, but the flawed organization of institutions and power. Rousseau opens the social contract by stating that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels open the Communist Manifesto with, "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." In his letter to a member of the National Assembly, Edmund Burke, however, suggests that in the reconciliation of liberty and order, individuals' passions forge their fetters. For Burke, these are civilizing restraints based on deficiencies of conduct and character, not obstacles to abstract freedom. Following Rousseau's lead, liberals are more inclined to emancipate the individual from all forms of authority beyond the self, including tradition. The self that Rousseau wants to liberate is not what Irving Babbitt termed the higher self, but what he calls the ordinary self, the part of human character that follows impulse and desire, the very part that Burke argues should be chained. In Rousseau's formulation of democracy, the people are not checked by government, as James Madison and the American framers suggest, because government under the social contract is created by and promotes the general will. When individuals obey the government, they are following their own will. In other words, the people's natural goodness precludes the need for government, in Madison's words, to control the governed, or to refine and enlarge the public views. Alexander Hamilton asks in Federalist 15, "Why has government been instituted at all?" He answers as a conservative, "Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint." One of the greatest points of divergence between liberalism and conservatism, and between variants of conservatism, is their respective views of tradition. Tradition's greatest conservative defender is Burke. One reason why liberals generally, and some conservatives, oppose traditional conservatism is because of its view of the relationship between tradition, reason, and moral universality. Traditional conservatives assume, to use the title of a book by Emmy Bradford, that tradition is a better guide than reason. Why do traditional conservatives trust tradition and historical experience more than reason? Why is tradition a more reliable standard than reason? Reason, as David Hume noted, is a slave to passion. It is subject to rationalization and ideological distortion. Moreover, reason has a tendency to intellectualize problems of morality and order. Rational constructs are, after all, not normative. Experience is normative. Consequently, experience is a better guide than reason because it not only contains the wisdom of the ages, the experience of trial and error that is tested by time, but it is universality incarnate. Tradition embodies historical experience by giving it form that enables its preservation and transmission through generations. In other words, the conservative defense of tradition is a defense of historical experience and community, a recognition that humans need to learn from and to some extent imitate the best examples from history. Ryan Holston explains the Burkean sense of imitation. A tradition is essential to making moral decisions, not because the past is to be copied, but because it provides the normative orientation that is essential for new moral decisions. A tradition thus provides a normative sensibility and inspiration to moral decision makers rather than patterns of conduct merely to be replicated. Machiavelli appreciates the value of historical examples in learning the virtues of statecraft. Yet he is careful to note, quote, "You cannot walk exactly in the footsteps of those who have gone before." Historical experience requires adaptation and creativity that reconstitute it in new circumstances. As Klaus Rinn notes, the absorption of the heritage enriches the present, ultimately because it helps capture universality. Conservatives are mindful that tradition is an instrument for expressing and preserving experiences of order that recall and bring to life past experiences that enrich human understanding and animate souls in contemporary life. Burke's eternal contract of the dead, living, and yet to be born, as well as his notion of the little platoon, is inspired by the spirit of a gentleman and the spirit of religion, integrate tradition, historical experience, and community. As Rinn explains, the good life is a communal creation, not only in the sense that it entails cooperation of the living, but because it involves the efforts of previous generations. Tradition is the primary means by which past generations communicate with the living generation. It is the link that connects the great chain of being. When Burke, Babbitt, and Kirk appeal to historical experience, they are not suggesting that it is self-interpreting or that experiences are of equal value. The distinction between experiences of higher and lower qualities can be illustrated with an example from the contemporary film Stuck in Love. In the film, the father, William Borgens, encourages his son and daughter to develop their creative writing skills. William is a successful novelist. His daughter has just published her first novel with a major New York publisher while a college student. But his son, Rusty, a high school student, seems to be lagging behind. William attributes his son's delayed development as a writer to a lack of experience, a seemingly Burkean point. Yet when the father explains what he means by experience that will inspire fiction writing, he means for Rusty to do things that he keeps from his father because they are morally dubious. In short, the father tells his son to be a hedonist and perhaps even a rake so that he can fictionalize such experiences. Rusty takes his father's advice and increases his drug use, gets in fights with classmates, and engages in premarital sex with a drug addict who he refers to as an angel in a poem he has written for English class. When the father finds out about Rusty's behavior, he is incredulous. He seems to believe that his teenage son can engage in debauchery as an act of utility to improve his writing without degenerating into moral chaos. It does not dawn on him that his son might get bitten if he holds the tiger by the tail, or that experience with the lower will does not create knowledge of what T.S. Eliot and Edmund Burke called the permanent things. From a Babbittian perspective, the father has the situation upside down. He is what Babbitt refers to as spiritually lazy or spiritually indolent, unwilling to do ethical work that enriches the soul and invigorates the mind and imagination. To be a great fiction writer requires experiential range that must include extensive experience with the higher forms of human experience. One can know the lower by the higher, but not the reverse. What separates conservatives from stale traditionalists and antiquarians is the non-ideological nature of Burke's philosophy of tradition. An ideological view of tradition approaches the view that tradition is A, sufficient by itself to represent and compel individuals to the good, B, is not an approximation of the good, but the good reified in the particular form that should be imitated in its original form, and C, does not need to be reconstituted to adapt to changing circumstances. The Burkean philosophy of tradition, A, views tradition as a central part of the quest for the good life, but insufficient by itself to attune individuals and society to it. B, because tradition at its best is an approximation of the good, finding, realizing the good universality in changing circumstances requires adaptation and reformulation of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Tradition is therefore, C, the product of synthesis, the blending of old and new. The old keeps individuals connected to past experiences of order and the lessons of historical life, and the new provides adjustments to new circumstances. It orients individuals to a quality of character that is prepared to synthesize universality and historical particularity. Note that Burke does not argue that tradition is of ready application in the emergency. Prejudice is of ready application. Prejudice stems from tradition. It is an orientation, a disposition, a manner of thinking and imagining the possibilities and responsibilities of life. Prejudice creates moral ballast in the turbulence of circumstances that have no blueprint with which to guide statesmen and individuals. Prejudice is not, in other words, a reified doctrine or dogma. It is closer to the thing that makes tradition a living force, a quality of character that is guided by tradition, guided by historical experience, and capable of creative discovery of universality in the flux of particularity. As Klaus Rinn explains, tradition never gives final expression to man's higher destiny. The work of civilization requires an assimilation of mankind's noblest spiritual traditions and creativity in their application to new circumstances. It is in this sense that Kirk speaks of dynamic tradition, tradition that adapts over time. Burke makes the case for dynamic tradition when he states that in what we improve, we are never wholly new. In what we retain, we are never wholly obsolete. Rinn adds that the sign of a creative culture would be that it manages to weed out that in its traditions which is only temporarily conditioned, transitory, or of marginal value, and keep strong that which speaks to man's central and enduring concerns. And in the interest of time, we still have about 30 minutes. I will open the floor for questions. And if you have a question, there are
microphones.
There are microphones.
On the sides. Raise your hand.
Just
and
raise
we'll
your
pass you the
hand.
microphone.
Please try to keep your questions brief, and if you would like, direct them to a particular panelist or to all the panelists so that we can get as many questions in as possible.
Rob Coons, this is for Micah and Matthew, I guess, both, because you both touched on this idea of abstraction. And I really wanted to pick up on Micah's point that the whole problem with abstraction is that it's too abstract. And in particular, right, so here's my question, I guess. Isn't it true that we need to distinguish an ancient model of abstraction in Plato and Aristotle from the modern model of conception, of abstraction that you find in Occam and Locke and all the way through Kant, right, in which the abstract idea is something it's mental, it's internal, it involves deleting information from experience, whereas the Platonic Aristotelian notion, abstraction is what connects us to something that's out there in the world, the Platonic form, the universal, which is always rich, inexhaustible, something that we're constantly filling in. So if we make that distinction, doesn't it sort of clear up the confusion that you're suggesting, Micah, that conservatives should be in favor of the ancient model of abstraction and opposed to the modern notion?
Yeah, that sounds really good. And it's not surprising that an analytical philosopher would help us figure that out. So I think that would be right. And then I guess I'd want to maybe tease out a little bit to what extent are the different modern thinkers, even if they are shifting and changing from which ones are truly different The Scottish Enlightenment is going to be a little bit different than the French Enlightenment, right? I think we would get a little more mileage from that. Well, that's the conversation to have. But no, I accept that. I think that would be a really helpful distinction.
Two words that need to be revised in our vocabulary and brought back to earlier acceptations is abstraction and then the Greek theoria. That abstraction is an entrance into being. It's a going out of yourself to be present in being. It's not prescinding. It's not shaking the dust of being away so that you can get at some abstract idea. That's in classical thought. Whereas what you're describing is in late scholasticism, the development towards what will eventually become the Kantian idea of the schema, where abstraction really becomes an imposition on otherwise unintelligible matter. That is connected in maybe a path that I'm not going to pursue right now in any depth, but just very briefly, I just would want to couple with that the idea of reconceiving theoria, the idea of theory. I know we have Ben Lockard in the audience, so we have a retired English professor who suffered through the age of literary theory, where I mentioned rape in my remarks, and that's what I was thinking of, the rapacious treatment of theory as an abstract schema to impose itself by force on reality, whereas in fact, we can look to Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture for the most winsome account of this, but that theoria is in fact a setting back, a passive receptivity and a letting be so that reality can form us. And those two things are related because they're both, the modern use of abstraction and the modern use of theory both reconceive the intellectual life as an act of violence. And the classical understanding of both of these things understands the intellectual life as pure gift. And what I wanted to argue in my remarks, had Michael not so rudely kept me to my time limit, is indeed we need to get back to an understanding of the position of the human being in the world as one is responding to gift.
Yeah, and for Professor Wilson, kind of related, you mentioned something about the Ars Poetica that Burke picked up on, and it sounded like he had a mimetic sort of understanding of things, but he also was sentimental and sort of went into like poesis a little bit. I'm trying to understand both what mimesis and poesis are in my own life. And your comment?
Yeah, thanks. So it was kind of an important hinge in my argument. When Burke cites Horace in the Ars Poetica, he's doing something that's venerable and that embeds him back in a tradition that goes back across the centuries to, of course, Horace's day and then before that. And that's recognizing that the orderliness of the poet, meaning the ordering of language into meter, is the prototype of the properly human activity of bringing order into the world. But that activity is specifically not an artificial imposition of order that wasn't there, but a kind of listening to quite literally, the music of the spheres, and the understanding that there's an orderliness embedded in reality, and that human activity, its artifice, is entirely natural, something that Burke tells us. Man's nature is art. That it's something that's entirely natural and that is a properly human activity. So there's no hard distinction between art and nature. Artifice for human beings is a mere bringing into human life and to human political and cultural order natural principles that are to be discerned from contemplating the intelligibility of things. My criticism of Burke is that while he cites this tradition by way of Horace, that he no longer has to put it crudely, the epistemology in place to actually make complete sense of it. And that's because he's working with a sentimental idea of how we make moral judgments or how we perceive good and evil.
Thank you to all the panelists for your interesting papers. I have a question about natural law, which was a theme that was implicit or explicit in all four papers. I was thinking about Dr. Kirk's essay, The Case for and Against Natural Law, in which he sort of comes to a kind of ambivalent position where he endorses natural law as a sort of political foundation and an ethical guide, but he doesn't necessarily say that it should govern day-to-day political decisions or even judicial decisions. And so I guess I'd like to pose the question to all the panelists. To what extent should natural law guide day-to-day politics as opposed to sort of being something in the background or part of our wardrobe of the moral imagination, as it were? Thank you.
You're the experts. You're the expert.
I'm not, well, gosh. Michael mentioned that under the umbrella of conservatism, there are various debates going on, and there is a very interesting debate on that question, particularly when it comes to jurisprudence. People like Hadley Arcus and the idea that the natural law is available and should really guide judges in coming to good conclusions about cases, in distinction with other folks like Robert George and other folks who would say, no, the job of the judge, following kind of how Scalia would look at this, and say what the law is. The job of the legislature is to perhaps make a law or vote on a law based on what you think it should be. So much depends on what you mean by natural law, what Kirk means by what we mean by it. I think it's inescapable, and there's always this other consideration of it's not as if you don't have natural law that you just have the perfect answer or a vacuum. There's some other approach that you're going to be using, where that might be tradition, that might be other ways of understanding what should be done and how to vote. I don't think natural law is the sort of discipline or the sort of thinking tool that's going to have immediate purchase on, say, a question of what the tax rate should be, this, that, or the other. That's where prudence, I really think, comes in. Natural law can tell us that human life is valuable and important. It's going to leave it up to prudence to decide whether that's going to be protected or manifested in traffic laws by driving on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. So my answer, I guess, is yes and no. I think natural law is going to be involved. I think it is it's impossible to describe the American founding without talking about the role that natural law played. But in some respects, political decisions and policies are not going to be directly guided by the natural law, but they will be guided by a framework that I think the natural law provides insofar as it talks about human flourishing and what that looks like.
The way I would put it is I think of the natural law tradition as a kind of authority that you accept or you don't accept. And in many ways, it's analogous to sort of the revelation of Scripture, right? Do you accept it or do you not accept it as God's word? And if you don't accept it, like if you have two people, one who accepts it and one who doesn't, they're going to have a hard time having a conversation about it, right? Because they don't accept the same kind of authority. Versus people who might both accept Scripture as authoritative might still disagree on many different parts of it and how they interpret it. And so I think natural law is similar in some ways, where those who are in the family of natural law, if you will recognize certain kinds of things as having weight and warrant, and that the reality exists, that nature exists, that there's immutable elements to it, that it has implications for how we order our lives and our communities and so forth, without necessarily being able to arrive at some of the prudential or very detailed judgments that are not prescribed in nature itself. So that's how I think about it. And so I think that's maybe why Kirk is ambivalent about it. Like on the one hand, it's important as operating within this kind of framework and it has this authority. On the other hand, very difficult to agree on many of the particular workings out of it. We might agree on very broad things, but as we get more nuanced and more particular, there's going to be different schools and interpretations that are going to be flowing out of that kind of approach to the world.
I would agree with everything that my colleagues have said and emphasize that I think the best the natural law can do is provide us with rather general moral limits, moral boundaries, but that ultimately in politics especially, great discretion is needed to apply that law and to understand that law in changing circumstances, remembering that we don't as human beings have perfect knowledge of that law. And even Aquinas tells us that there's only part of the eternal law that we can know, and only part of it we can know through reason, and that's what the natural law is. But an example of, I think, the limits of natural law would come in something like just war theory. how much in advance of a particular war or set of circumstances can you provide guidelines to statesmen who are trying to decide whether or not a war should be fought, how the war is fought, how the peace is conducted? I mean, all of that has to be worked out in a way, and I think Kirk's point is the general premise of natural law can be a guide, like principles are a guide, but that ultimately the work of statesmanship is the work of discretion, that you can't decide in any a priori way. And insofar as natural law can be pushed too far, it pushes too close to that a priori point and hamstrings the statesman in circumstances and takes morality to be something as an abstraction in the bad sense instead of in the good sense. It should provide reflective distance so that you're not taken away by the passion of the moment. But at the end of the day, moral decisions have to be made in circumstances that are unknown in the past and only known in the present.
My question to Professor Michael Federici.
Federici, good enough.
Federici, sorry for that. In the past, probably I should stand up. In the past several years, there's a national conservative movement, which also generates a lot of debates among the conservative circle. Could you please say a few words about the similarities and the differences between traditional conservatism and the national conservatism? Or, if you like, maybe the question can be framed as, what's the role of the nation state in the traditional conservatism? Thank you very much.
Okay, so what can I say in a few minutes about the similarities and differences between what you're calling national conservatism, what I called nationalistic populism, and traditional conservatism? I'd say there's a few things to highlight the differences between the two that are noteworthy, starting with the fact that traditional conservatives have a great appreciation for the constitutional system, the historical and theoretical system created by the American framers. Checks and balances, separation of powers, the suspicion of power, especially a suspicion of concentrated power. And national conservatives, nationalistic populists have, I think, for pragmatic reasons, come to the conclusion that the constitutional system is broken and that it's okay to abandon that constitutional tradition to make certain political gains in the short run, and that is to concentrate power into a populist leader, to abandon largely the system of separated powers in the hope that you can kind of destroy the administrative state, the deep state, as it's sometimes called, the administrative state. And I don't know what happens after that, because I don't hear them talk about a period of restoration when we would say return to the tradition and the system of the framers. I think that they're most interested in the short run and not in the long run. And that's not to say that there aren't things that the two sides share in common. The use of tariffs and a kind of economic nationalism can be perfectly consistent with traditional conservatism, where instead of putting economic efficiency as the highest good, you put community as the highest good, if that in fact is what's being done. So I'm not saying that they're diametrically opposed, but there are certainly significant differences between the two. I would say that traditional conservatives would probably be most concerned about the idea that so much loyalty would be placed in an executive leader that you would lose sight of the importance of the Constitution itself and of constitutional law, and that the loyalty ought to be to the Constitution, not to any particular leader. And I'll leave it there.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? I'm going to, since I already started talking. So, because Klaus Klaus Rinzau was, in my years of being in his presence, was always talking about our present post-constitutional order. So maybe you could share some reflections on what he would say in response to some of the problems you mentioned. And then just while I've got you by the buttonhole, where would you place Alexander Hamilton in this schema?
Energetic executive.
Okay. Let me start with Hamilton first. Hamilton is living at a time when I'm not sure that the categories would make a great deal of sense, although you could use the categories in a way to understand Hamilton's politics. So Hamilton is an economic nationalist. He is also someone who is very much wedded to having a strong, energetic executive. But Hamilton, I think the case that Hamilton is, surely that he's in favor of monarchy, which he was not, is overstated. He was in favor of a popular branch of the legislature. He was in favor of an independent judiciary, so he is very much on board with the framers' system of separated powers and checks and balances. In fact, if you read something like Federalist 9, I think you could make the case that Hamilton fits quite well, at least in that writing, as a traditional conservative, in the way that I've described it in my presentation. And why do I say that? Well, in Federalist 9, Hamilton takes up the question, is Republican government the right form of government for the United States? And he oddly says, well, if you look at the history of republics, Greece and Rome in particular, they oscillated from extremes, and they were not moderate, they were immoderate. But he says, we've learned things that were unknown to the ancients from experience. And what we've learned is that Republican government can be moderated to avoid those great swings in extremes. And then he goes through a list of the things, which he includes things like federalism and representation and an independent judiciary and a large republic. All of those things. He's doing with the framers what I suggested and what Russell Kirk suggests good conservatives do. They reconstitute a tradition. They don't abandon it, but they reconstitute it. And that's what I would argue the American framers did with the great Western tradition of republicanism. They reconstituted it. Now, in Klaus's case, I think part of what he is attempting to do in talking about a post-constitutional era is to say that we're at one of those crucial historical points in which significant reconstitution is necessary, and that the progressive movement has wreaked such havoc on our constitutional system that it's unrecognizable it would be unrecognizable to the people who created it. So that, you know, some pretty significant deep surgery is needed to rectify the situation, and that may mean that we have to make compromises with principles that we have long held, and that oddly enough, the decentralization of power, which is greatly needed, may require the centralization of power in the short run, and that this is one of those instances when what we need are very creative thinkers who are also wedded to a tradition that can reconstitute it in a way that will save the American tradition, not destroy it. But that's not an easy task.
Thank you. So the question is primarily for Professor Wilson, but if others have views, I'd also be very interested to hear, and it concerns Scruton's cognitive dualism. Mm-hmm. I wasn't entirely certain at the end if you meant to say that it is an incoherent idea or just an inadequate metaphysical foundation. You mentioned Thomas Nagel, but I wonder if you could expand more, if it is incoherent, why we should view it as such.
Oh, great, yeah, great question. So incoherence is one way of putting it. I think there's much to be said in its favor. The cognitive dualism of Scruton is responding to, just as Kant was responding to Hume 2 centuries before Scruton, is noting that a certain mechanistic and materialistic account of reality seems to be in the ascendant, but that there are certain aspects of human experience that can either be known and interpreted accurately through that method of thinking, and that those things need to somehow have a place assigned to them so that they may be preserved and understood. But I would propose that the way Kant sort of does it is, Newton's got the account of reality, but nonetheless we have to act as if there were a God, as if there were a spirit, and everything gets assigned to the as if, just as the average person might say something along the lines of, gosh, I'm pretty convinced of the nature red in tooth and claw account of reality that we find in, say, late Darwinian theory, but I still realize that I, love my children for reasons beyond their genetic utility. So how do I account for that in my life? And Scruton, starting from those premises, gives us a kind of rich, he builds up a rich living world, a world that we can live in as interpersonal beings. And in The Soul of the World, his focus is particularly on how this self-conscious I reaching out to the world and discovering there a you that is also an I, a subject-to-subject relationship, is so central to understanding, is so essential, to make a place where we can talk about morality, freedom, and responsibility. And I would simply propose that we can't do that, that there's no possibility of a doctrine of two truths, including even one that just says, well, I'll think about human beings as organisms one day and as my neighbor the second. That those things are always going to bleed into each other, and one ultimately will overrule the other. And so the thing to do, in my view, is to just go back to really, you might say, three classic texts. One, the opening of Aristotle's Metaphysics, where we recognize that anything we know is always in response to being. And so the mechanistic account just can't be correct because it doesn't adequately account for what knowing is. Two, thinking of things in terms of causality, that the intelligibility of nature is dependent on the four causes, including the fourth and final cause, as Aristotle gives it to us. So it's impossible for us to even talk about our response to reality except in terms of purposes, which means that we can't assign a special separate sphere for purposes. We have to acknowledge that purposes run all the way down, both from human action down into nature. Even worms have purposes. And then even quarks do. And then finally, the third one would be looking at the human person in particular, to return to Thomas Aquinas' Prima, questions 70 through 75 on the relationship of body and soul. That we need to not, we most certainly need to not be dualistic in our thinking, but that we have to understand the primacy of mind or of form in giving shape to the natural world. And so there can be no purely naturalistic account of reality. Reality is already informed by mind, by soul, by God's creative act from the very beginning. And so there's no need for an as-if, because we just have the fact of things.
If you want something simpler to read, you could look at C.S. Lewis as a short essay called Meditations in a Tool Shed. And in that essay, he describes how reality can be viewed and experienced in different ways. He talks about being in a dark tool shed where there's a ray of light coming in over the door, and he says it's one thing to look at that ray of light and observe the dust floating around in that ray of light, to observe the light beam. It's a totally different experience to go stand in that beam and to look out through the crack and to see the sky and the trees overhead. And he describes this as looking at something versus looking along something. And he's reflecting on these issues, again, in a much more tangential kind of way or superficial way of how do we describe things in the world? Do we describe them in this sort of abstract or separated, purely mechanical sense, or do we describe them in an experiential way when we talk about love or when we talk about the right or the good? So you can look at that, or if you want, again, a more kind of scientific, philosophical approach, you could look at the work of Michael Piani as well, thinking about this in his book, Personal Knowledge.
Okay, we've come to the end of our panel, and we will break for half an hour, reconvene at 3:30 for the second panel of the day, and for the next half hour, we'll have refreshments outside the door. Thank you very much.